Good afternoon, everyone. First of the message, we have an ASCOT next week. Now, question time, if you could please remember to speak directly into the end like I'm doing now, rather than going down the edge. It won't work. So directly into it, because we're looking for plenty of questions today. Now, also, we will probably be replacing the microphone, which is in the camera there, because our speaker is having difficulty hearing us, and it comes, so our words go through the speakers, then they go into the microphone on that little camera there, and then on to Lisa. So I'll be checking in a moment if she can hear us. So yeah, please ask plenty of questions. That'd be wonderful. Lisa, hi, it's Paul here. Can you hear me?
Yes, thank you.
That sounds great. Okay. Soil social scientists designed a case study in Queenstown Lakes and Central Otago districts to identify influences behind wildfire risk perceptions and preparedness in a high wildfire risk urban area of the rural-urban interface. So that's known as RUI. A series of interviews, focus groups and workshops with key stakeholders and residents, and a postal online survey of residents have brought new knowledge to understand how to encourage residents in complex urban fringe neighbourhoods towards better preparation for wildfire and other hazards. Permanent residents from more than 250 homes, which are nestled in highly flammable Kanuka vegetation on the steep slopes of Mount Iron, Wanaka, exhibited high wildfire awareness, and they've started to take individual household and collective community preparedness actions and are considering additional actions. However, the wildfire awareness and preparedness measures of the wider community displayed lower fire risk awareness and also reports of the use of potential additional sources. Biography: Lisa Langer is a senior scientist from SCIO, which is the New Zealand Forest Research Institute, and she has led the SCIO Rural Fire Research Group's social wildfire research since 2003. Her qualitative research on understanding fire risk awareness, preparedness, community resilience, and effective firefighting communication has brought changes in how fire agencies engage and communicate with communities in Aotearoa. Please welcome Lisa.
Kia ora, and thank you, Paul. I'm going to introduce myself in Te Reo just very briefly, as that's our custom, and also just to say that this is being recorded, and I hope everybody's comfortable with that, but just please be wary of that in terms of your participation. Ke te mana whenua tēnā koutou, ko Lisa Langer tōku ingoa, ko Ngāti Aotearoa te iwi, ko San tōku wahi mahi, tō rea tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Thank you for the introduction, Paul. I did sit in the background, eavesdropped into Grant Pearce's presentation last week, so I will try and pick up the conversation that he left a week ago and give you a bit of a general background in terms of some of our research, and then I will certainly focus on our recent case study in the Wanaka area. I'm very happy to take questions either at the end, or if something's not clear, I'm quite happy to break. So just whatever you like. Whoops, that's not a good start, is it? I'll try with the mouse. Right. This is kind of recapping on where Grant left you, just to remind you that generally we get over 4,000 small wildfires each year, covering about 5,500 hectares, or should I say that used to be the position in the range of 2015 to 2020. And I will show you what's been happening since. But just to remind you that nearly all of our wildfires are caused by human activity, and that most of them are generally escapes from agricultural burns, cooking and campfires, and generally into the grass and shrublands of our landscape. Now, I thought I would also, in my introduction, just define, because I will use this term quite frequently, the rural-urban interface. So just to give you a little bit of an understanding, it's not just a vague term, it is based on an internationally recognized definition, and it's the distance between vegetation and the houses. But in New Zealand, because of the ember distances being quite different for the common New Zealand species, we've actually reduced that from the international standard of 2.4 kilometres to 500 kilometres. Sorry, 500 meters, whoops. But it's, I will probably generally refer to the RUI, or the rural-urban interface, as a composite term, but to indicate that it is made up of two components, what we call generally the intermix, which is a little bit like life, where we will probably more commonly call it lifestyle blocks, where we've got residential properties and other urban buildings, but they're interdispersed and they're predominantly amongst a rural land use. Whereas the true interface, or what we're increasingly calling the urban fringe, is that sharp boundary between urban and rural. So it's when there are dense areas of suburban housing or industrial areas abutting areas of vegetation. To give you a bit of an illustration, this is from the Port Hills fire in 2017. So the orange areas are the areas that were burnt. And you'll see the area at the top of the screen is true interface. So that's where there is a sharp boundary between the houses and the vegetation, just in contrast to these two areas in blue with what we call intermix. So we've got lifestyle properties interdispersed amongst the rural area. I think Grant probably showed you this graph, but just to remind you that things have been changing over the last few years, and the graph shows the number of houses destroyed or damaged, and growing number of fire incidents. So that goes up to 2021. And just to kind of put into the picture of some of the quite significant fires that we have had. So the Port Hills fire that I've just referred to, and just to say, I was actually evacuated from this fire, or should I correct and say I self-evacuated because I could see the need to go before someone came and knocked on my door, sorry. But that did destroy 9 houses, and another 6 were damaged. Unfortunately, the life of the helicopter pilot was lost. And I walk regularly in this area, and there's still the remnants of burnt trees, the reminders of the significant fire that occurred right on the boundary of Christchurch. It's quite a large area. Then 2 years later, there was the Nelson Tasman fire, or sometimes referred to the Pigeon Valley fire. This was even more significant in terms of number of people evacuated, and also the number of livestock that had to be evacuated. A little bit larger in area, large area of production forest destroyed, and fortunately only one house lost. There was a large, even larger tussock fire in East Otago the same year, and what was significant about that, it was an area of a water catchment that was burned for the city of Dunedin. 2020, a bit closer to home for Southlanders, the Pukaki Downs fire occurred, considered to be started by a gas cooker, and that burned over 3,000 hectares. And then hard to go past the significance of the Lake Oho fire, October 2020, which burned over 5,000 hectares and consumed 50%, half the homes in the village. So about 48 homes and structures, another 6 severely damaged, and miraculously the whole community, the whole village managed to escape in the night. So quite enormous impact to a small regional community, rural community. I won't have time to go into all of these, but these are the case studies that I have conducted over the years, generally in terms of communities that have experienced a significant wildfire. So they've been spread across the country, and that's how we've learned a lot about people's awareness, both before an event and their changed activities as a result of a fire, in terms of whether they're better prepared for the next one, or think that they've actually had their fire and now they don't need to really be so concerned. We are also very mindful of the history of fire and our Indigenous Maori culture, and the mythology of the 5 fingers and the remaining finger, the little finger that was the surviving offspring, Toiti, which has been impersonated in the form of kokomako tree, which you may be familiar with. So, you know, very much grounded in Maori mythology, but certainly very highly used and respected by early Maori and Maori today. It was essential to their life. They used a fire plough to create heat, to cook their food, to clear vegetation. They used it for hunting, lighting, pest control, and even felling trees or bending wood for weapons. This kind of knowledge gives us some background to understanding communities and their use of fire today, and it kind of lays the foundation for our current research, particularly with Maori within our communities. I listed there some of the many studies that we have done over the years, and as Paul said, I have been working in this area since early 2000s. I think it's 2003. A lot of focus on fire danger warning communication, how to get effective communication out to the right audience, using the right mechanisms of transfer of information. We looked at the economic cost of wildfires, and that's ongoing by economists. We were funded by, well, not what's now Fire and Emergency New Zealand, around looking at changing public behaviour. And as we know, that's a very tricky thing to do. We still have people who will smoke and drive without safety belts, despite the evidence. So changing actual behaviour can be enormously difficult. Led by one of my colleagues, and I must acknowledge that there is a team behind us, and Andrea Grant led some work on formal and informal volunteers, which I'll provide a slide on. And I understand there may even be some volunteers or former volunteers in the audience, so a vital part of fire management. My research hasn't been all just focused on wildfires. It's hard to talk about wildfires without talking about other natural hazards. And some of my research has been done in association with studying communities affected by earthquakes. Certainly when we studied the Kaikoura earthquake, very hard to talk about wildfires when communities just experienced a massive earthquake, but they're obviously a similar means of preparedness. Risk awareness. If you ask a New Zealand community about risk, I mean, certainly earthquakes or flooding are probably the ones that spring to mind. Depending on the area, obviously, volcanic eruptions, snowfall, which is probably quite a concern in Southland, and perhaps growing concern of tsunamis. But wildfires, often people are thinking of Australia or North America, even the Mediterranean, rather than New Zealand. So certainly something that we can't assume that people will naturally think that wildfires are a concern for New Zealand. Though with the more recent impacts on our communities, we consider that to be growing. A few years ago, I, with a colleague from the University of Alberta, did a case study, looked at the community of Kurikuri Peninsula up in the far north, and we certainly found that people were more aware of wildfires if they understood their local environment, and the residents of this area had a very good understanding of the environment, strong attachment to ancestral land, having had those particularly that had experienced wildfires and the one that had affected their community. And so being, guardians of the land, knowledge passed down and through the whānau, but also this role of the rural fire brigade, because each brigade member is actually a member of the community and have their own whānau and connections to the community. So we had a lot of learning from that community. It was a community that their houses were probably quite dissimilar to the illustration on the top right-hand corner. A lot of them were modest dwellings, but I was very aware that if a fire destroyed one of their houses, they could be standing and their only assets would be the clothes they were wearing, because not necessarily insured, low insurance, and not necessarily well resourced or even within the whānau to rebuild quite modest houses. But obviously that's all that some people own. The community that I'll describe in a few minutes is a lot more of a high socioeconomic, with a lot more obviously well-established houses, and some of those being second homes with a high level of insurance. But some of the community had taken measures with water sources, pumps and hoses, keeping grass and vegetation mown, and making some efforts to prepare their homes or make them less likely to be ignited, and plans to evacuate to the beach should another wildfire occur. Jumping down the country and in time too, 2007 was the year of the Port Hills fire, and we didn't have the resources to do a full study of the Port Hills, but we went to news reports, social media, and learnt what we could in terms of the community, their awareness that seemed to be really quite low. Surprised that wildfire could reach and into urban neighbourhoods in terms of the impact it would like to have, and kind of very much aware that the awareness diminishes quite quickly in some communities over time, depending on the level of impact. And, you know, I certainly can, as I said before, I was in the neighbourhood and talking with my neighbours, some of which sneaked through roadblocks and re-entered the area before official clearance was given, but they're feeling that they weren't actually in danger because they were in the urban area. But history and international experience shows us that fire can actually extend not just to the houses on the perimeter, or on the fringe, but those also into the suburban areas. I promised a slide on the formal and informal volunteers. So some of the firefighters, paid members, and the enormous community and contribution from volunteers, particularly in the rural community, vital part of not only fighting fires, and, you know, unfortunately they have to attend road accidents and do all sorts of other work, but I think they also play quite a role in terms of educating or spreading the message of the not only the awareness when fire danger is increasing in an area, but also the need to be better prepared for wildfires. So I will pause at that point. Are you with me if I now extend into talking about the our case study in the Wanaka Albert Town area? All right, I'll just check no idea how the time's progressing. All right. We were funded by predominantly the Resilience to Nature Challenges, one of the National Science Challenges, and some allied funding from MPI, the Ministry of Primary Industries, and a small area of funding from Fire and Emergency FENS for a survey. So we joined together all our funding sources, small that they were, but to enable us to do quite an interesting and substantial study. So the area is probably reasonably well known to you. No doubt many of you visited holidays, maybe even have a holiday house there, or know people that do. So very much a tourist area, rapidly increasing with new developments, and a high proportion of the rural-urban interface. The photo on the top left of the slide, the yellow line, shows you our study areas. So we didn't look at the whole of Wanaka. We focused on northern Wanaka and Albert Town, and the dark areas are the lake, so bounded to the north by the Clutha River. So I hope you got a bit of a picture of the area. I don't know if you can see my pointer, but in the middle here is Mount Iron, and that's where the photo at the base of the slide shows the area that we were particularly interested in and asked to study. The request came from Fire and Emergency New Zealand, who were concerned that we should provide some more knowledge of how to prepare the community in the area. So we looked at the census in terms of the number of residents, the dwellings they occupied, over a third of them being holiday dwellings, and quite a high income and wealth index for the area. We managed to interview or have focus groups with 64 people from both key agencies, so being Fringe, Department of Conservation, Civil Defence and Emergency, Otago Regional Council, and definitely the Queenstown District Council. And then the Rural Urban Interface residents were generally from residents associations. We were limited in budget, so we tried to be quite expedient the way we contacted people and had conversations. So some of them directly in an interview and some of them in a broader group, but we always record, and then we've got transcripts to go back to really piece together and understand the views. We also we're in contact with a Pan Māori organisation to try and get some understanding of Māori in the community. Mount Iron, as I indicated, was the centre of our study, and certainly an area of over 250 homes, but generally nestled into vegetation, reasonably steep slopes. Some of the roads are just one way in, no alternative access out, inadequate water pressure for fire hydrants, and certainly challenges for not only getting firefighters in, but also to get residents out to evacuate on the same roads, which could be, challenging. And obviously, if a vehicle was to break down or to block the road in any way, it would impede progress. The real element of the concern was based around Kānuka, so allied to Mānuka, so I understand it was predominantly Kānuka, some Mānuka. Kānuka is classified as threatened, a nationally vulnerable species, and I understand it is tied up with the myrtle rust, which attacks myrtaceae, and the concern that Kānuka could be adversely affected because of the myrtle rust in the country. So there is a ban on clearing Kānuka for defensible space or being able to even replace it with another native species. Unfortunately, it is highly flammable, just as Mānuka is, and the dilemma is, life is never simple. The priorities are not just one element focused, and obviously today we're focusing on wildfire, but vegetation brings other benefits, biodiversity, soil and water protection, and obviously helps screen or merge residences into the landscape. So a lot of concern about the way going forward with the Kānuka vegetation. In our interviews, we were keen to understand the awareness of, so looking first at the Mount Iron, the permanent residents, and we unfortunately were not able to talk with the holiday residents or tenants thereof of the holiday properties. So this is just the residents that I can report on, but certainly they had not only a high awareness, but anxiety, or certainly the ones that we spoke to. They were worried about evacuation, the removal of the Kānuka, as I was just mentioning, as being a real concern. And some were aware of the flammability of cedar-clad houses, fire truck access, evacuation issues, but also the number of daily visitors that walk on the recreational area of Mount Iron each day. So some of these people had been very proactive in taking initiatives. Some certainly recognise the need to have informal plans to evacuate, so at least discuss them with their family, considering evacuation routes. Neighbourhood Residents Association were not only discussing it, but becoming quite vocal with the council, and they had cleared some vegetation, including some of the kānaka, which was supposed to be kept intact. And then many of them proposed to do more measures, including people discussing there were actually a few bunkers built, though I understand they were more within existing areas of garages, and but to concern that they might have to shelter in place or withstand a wildfire on site, and even down to unnamed and jumbled house numbers to make sure it was easier for authorities to actually come with a call out. Certainly the remaining concerns again feature around the kānaka, and worried about the ability to ensure whether that will be affected in the future, narrow roads, inaccessible driveways, cul-de-sacs, no alternative access, and really brings the awareness of planning and the fact that these difficult situations were set up in the development. So I will refer to that in terms of our future work as I get to the end of the presentation. Excuse me, I'll just have a mouthful. The wider community, and I have to acknowledge that we didn't have the resources to do a really thorough study of the wider community, but we tried to talk with some of the residents. We certainly learned more about holiday homes and rental properties, the difficulties of both New Zealanders and international visitors in the area, the number of preschools and primary schools, a holiday park with even short-term and semi-permanent residents there. So we did go to preschool, the holiday park, and really try and get some knowledge from some of the prominent people in the area. But they did report that there were still fireworks and braziers, that diagram on the left, the right, and for those that smoked, the disposal of their cigarette butts, and it did seem that they had a lower awareness of wildfire. I mentioned that we did talk with a Pāo Māori organisation in the area. There are probably a bit under 10% of Māori, but a lot of them are not necessarily from Ngāi Tahu. Many of them were what we would call matawaka, so Māori from other parts of other iwi of New Zealand who are working and living in the area, and particularly around Queenstown. And they brought their own traditional knowledge, and in terms of the northwest winds bringing fire, the fact that cooking should be done in the cool at night, always having a water source near a fire, and keeping away from housing. Through COVID, there are some advantages of COVID in our community, is that a charitable trust, the Mana Tahuna Charitable Trust, had formed, and we had communication. They're very keen that they should have information coming to them and made more aware of what they could do with wildfire. So a really good access point into the community where knowledge would be shared widely within through the whānau, no marae in the area, but use of meeting halls such as the one in Hawea, so in the wider area. Just brush over, but quite a big chunk of work. My colleague, and certainly like to acknowledge Simon Wegner, reviewed over 123 publications from around the world, predominantly New Zealand, Australia, Canada, and the US. And he came up with over 1,000 recommendations of how to mitigate. So what preparations to take that would reduce the impact or a fire occurring. And so he looked at it in different themes, whether building or landscaping around a property, maintenance, emergency plans, and the responding to a wildfire. So that was taking New Zealand and international literature, but through our study, we got good input from fire and emergency, particularly fire engineers, but also the rural fire officers. And what we were looking at was the appropriateness for our New Zealand context, aligning with existing policies and building codes. And then we had workshops with the Queenstown District Council and some residents in the area to really try and understand a little bit about, were these measures likely to be taken up by residents, or would they just be there as advice and not implemented. We were certainly mindful of the fact that this was initial work and that in some situations they wouldn't be feasible, so we were looking at it for a national guide. And obviously areas like Mount Iron are quite particular in terms of the nature of the requirement, but we've got a really good database which will be going up online for people to access and find what measures they could take, or at least work towards. So, but still following, the building code and the other criteria that are laid down. So I'd just like to now move to another means of collection of data that we did in the Wanaka Albert Town, and here definitely acknowledge again Simon Wegner, who conducted a survey with a little bit of input from me, but primarily Simon. And so what we were doing was that community around Wanaka, the North Wanaka Albert Town community, slightly broadened boundaries. We did a postcard letter drop, a mail out to about 2,000 residents in November 2020. I should say that prior to COVID, we had this envisaged that we would employ some students or young people to go and knock on doors with an iPad and collect and record the data at the door, and you realize just how quickly you change your method, because even if we could get someone into the area, that people are a little bit more reticent about opening their door to someone they haven't met in times of COVID. So our population there, in terms of our respondents, so we had 286 valid respondees, very high level of tertiary education. The level of income were those that indicated was very high, predominantly New Zealand European or European, and just a few more women than men that responded to the survey. And those images show the postcard that was put in letterboxes. There was also posters around the area that we tried to remind people to activate their personalized code, the QR code, or to just scan on a poster and access the online survey. So I won't have time for all the results, but just to draw you to some of them, is that there certainly was concern about wildfire among those living in the higher risk areas. And what we did do was, and this diagram shows that the blue bars are are the ones that are those within 200 metres from Mount Iron, and the orange ones are those greater than 200 metres from Mount Iron. And on the left is that people weren't concerned, and on the right, number 7, extremely concerned. So the blue lines certainly indicate that residents who were within 200 metres of Mount Iron were certainly considerably more concerned than those that were some distance away from Mount Iron. And I suppose interesting for us too that to have people who are even in that zone who were had a very low concern or were not concerned about it at all within that high wildfire risk area certainly kind of rings a few alarm bells to me. So what were people doing? And this is obviously what they reported doing rather than somebody going and checking, but most people did report that they were doing some kind of preparations, mitigation. 94% of them said they were insured, but over 90 of keeping their lawns both short and green. The discussing wildfire risk or mitigation with a fire expert was the least common action reported. And those that had lived in the area longer displayed higher levels of actions or mitigations. And certainly those that had witnessed a wildfire, just as up on that Kurri Peninsula fire, were certainly more aware and had undertaken more actions than those who hadn't had that experience. More limited mitigation actions, less or half of them were storing firewood and other fuels inside or within 5 meters of a house. And this is something I'm always telling my neighbors, make a point of saying I'm keeping my firewood away from my house and over the summer months, and then I'll bring it down close to the house for the winter months. I'm sure they think I'm a bit over the top, but it is a fuel source, keeping gutters clear, and thinning and pruning trees around the house. So there were limited uptake of some of these actions, but certainly some were cognizant of the need to do that. I mentioned household evacuation was quite a concern, and so we're interested in how many residents were over 65 years of age. And obviously still many are very active at that period, but we had data for higher age groups as well, and those with children who might need assistance in evacuating, so particularly if someone was at home with young children by themselves. And then livestock or pets, because we know from our international literature that people will often be very grounded by their pets. They won't necessarily want to go if their pet's missing, or certainly with livestock, with rural farmers too. And then I think this is my final piece of results, but just in terms of the perceptions of wildfire control, and interesting that many of the respondents believe that agencies are slightly more responsible than households for deciding people should evacuate during emergency, in terms of defending homes during a wildfire and ensuring people are aware of wildfire risk. So that feeling that agencies should be taking the lead. All surveys have influence, and we were holding off sending out the survey until we had collected all our qualitative data, so completed our interviews and and focus groups, and Fire and Emergency and the local council were very obliging, and they didn't start any of their public meetings until we had completed our data gathering too, because that could have affected our results if it was very fresh in their minds. But here are some of the comments that people made, that doing the survey had triggered some actions, or at least intention to actions. Again, we haven't gone back to check have they actually carried out, like making an evacuation plan, discussing with a firefighter neighbour, and perhaps seeking more information. But obviously there was a degree of moments of really trying to think through their own particular circumstances. Recommendations, and these are only a splattering of them, but what we do is that our research is aimed to really extend the knowledge of the agencies that have the ability and the means of putting our research into place. So we're very cognizant of the fact that we want to make it available for all councils and government agencies. We need to work more on those mitigations, need to certainly ensure that agencies are working with residents, and I would certainly acknowledge the work that Queenstown Lakes District Council and Fire and Emergency in particular are doing in this area. Certainly very high on their radar, and putting a lot of effort into it. Providing easily understood guidance, extending the knowledge, particularly through Māori as being a channel to extend knowledge through their networks. Very kind of cognizant of the fact that the short-term residents is an area that we haven't covered in our research, but very aware that that's a particular area of need. And certainly the need to consider the planning and tools for the future. Just one slide to say that we have now repeated this study as a national survey. So we've had over 1,000 respondents from both rural and rural-urban interface areas, and the awareness of fire was not nearly as high, and they placed a lot greater responsibility on the authorities, and really considered that there was little that they should be doing themselves in terms of wildfire risk in their area. So that's another presentation, no time for it today, but and we're still looking at the results. If you do want to take more information soon, and I hope very soon, that there will be access on the rural, we have our own website, the Rural Fire Research website, and the second and third, the first and second publications on that list were actually, we have them embargoed at present and have done since December, is that the Ministry for Primary Industries have sent the material to relevant ministers. So I think it's Conservation and Forestry. And so we're waiting for their consideration before they can be released. So we're anxiously waiting to be able to put our material up on these websites and make them freely available. And we're developing more summaries based around the interviews, and another one around the survey. So that's going to be a go-to for particularly agencies, but also residents who are interested. So hopefully we will get there. And just to say that I think the reason for delay is not to prevent the information to go out, but it's obviously the timing and making sure that ministers are adequately briefed. So we're on the assumption and understanding that it will be released. It's just a matter of the timing. So my last slide, other than my acknowledgements, is just to say that we were very fortunate that we have been granted further funding. This is something Grant, I think, mentioned. So we have now an extreme wildfire program where we're bringing the social science together with all the different biophysical science that Grant explained. And the learning that we had from the Wanaka Albert Town has really been the grounding for the study, and before that, our Port Hill study, and being very much aware that there was really quite a limit to what a landowner could do. So if they were in a situation where there was only one access route in, maybe a cul-de-sac and steep road, narrow road, they had surrounded by flammable vegetation, limitations on the ability to remove that and perhaps replace it with other native vegetation. Some of them said that, you know, when they bought, nobody explained to them the environment that they would be either building or moving into. The fact that wildfires generally travel uphill, and just the whole consideration of also climate change of the future, making it quite a high wildfire prone area. So we realized that instead of always focusing on the landowner and the difficulty of necessarily motivating and getting uptake, we realized that we needed to get it on the planning tables, on the within the policy. So that's why we're now focusing it and going to work from both ends, through the top down and the bottom up. So we will be working with communities as we've done from the bottom, but trying to, and we've brought in planners and evacuation experts to guide us of how we can really have that impact in terms of national, regional and district plans, work with architects, work with landscape architects. We're hoping even with the insurance agencies, so really try and come about it from quite a different perspective. And I'll just leave that there, and happy to open for questions, but you know, a lot of funders to acknowledge, and definitely my colleagues within the Rural Fire team, so certainly the Resilience to Nature's Challenge, Fire and Emergency New Zealand, and Ministry of Primary Industries being our funders of the past. Of the future, or we the MB, the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment, but certainly considerable support from Queenstown Lakes District Council, our advisory committee, and certainly the community and stakeholders of Wanaka and Queenstown. We couldn't have done it without them. So thank you.
Lisa, your research findings suggest a call to action on a variety of fronts. I'm sure there's going to be some really interesting questions. Would you like to start?
Yes, certainly.
I would like to ask Lisa, where is the nearest forest brigade to Albertown? Is it in Wanaka? And if it is, what reaction have they had to getting adequate equipment to battle something on the hillside?
I'm finding it a little hard to hear, but if I got it right, you're asking me about the nearest forest to Wanaka and what actions they may have be taking in terms of wildfire. Is that the nature of your question?
Is the nearest fire station?
Oh, the nearest fire station. I'm afraid I'll probably have to do a Google for that.
I think it's the volunteer fire station based in Albertown.
Yes, I know there's a Narrowtown fire brigade, so yes, I would imagine that's correct. And yes, and you know, certainly the call outs can go beyond that, and other brigades can you know, instantly active you know, jump into action as well should there be a call out.
Lisa, in our first talk, which was given by Tim Curran, he spoke quite widely of these green fire breaks, and he mentioned actually that some were being established on the Port Hills as well. Do you have any knowledge or view on possibly if such things would be useful on Mount Iron or other places as well which have high fire risk?
Yes, an interesting question, thank you. We have amassed knowledge over the years, some through observation, the work of Tim Curran and others in terms of testing flammability of species, and particularly native species, and that's one of the reasons what we know Kānaka and Mānuka are so flammable. One of the mitigations is to establish more, as you call them, green breaks and planting. And that's one of the reasons with our new research is to bring in landscape architects, because as I understand it, even today, some of the developments that are being proposed, if they have landscape plans that are suggesting planting more flammable species, so not aware of information that's freely available on the Fire and Emergency website that could be actually increasing the adverse issues into the future, but through selective selection of appropriate native species could in fact be creating, as you say, a green break that would be certainly beneficial.
Lisa, there are hundreds of people who do the Mount Iron walk, especially during the holiday season. Did any of your surveys get the perceptions of the local people about this? How do they feel about the number of walkers using the Mount Iron's recreation facility?
I think I can say that a number of our interviewees expressed it as being a concern, not in terms of people using the area, but should a wildfire occur, what that could mean for themselves and other members of the homes, the residents, if they're going to have people caught up on that mountain and their evacuation, you know, as an added risk. So certainly quite aware of the use of the area and the fact that walkers are probably not cognizant of the fact that there is high wildfire risk, any of them that might be smokers or you know, just the whole use of the area, but I think primarily in terms of evacuation of residents, sorry, of walkers as well as residents should a wildfire occur, and you know, the compounding the implications there.
Thank you.
You say that Kānaka and Mānuka are in high fire risk. Do you think sometime in the future they will have to be replaced with those that are less fire risk?
I'm sorry, I missed probably the vital bit of your sentence. What should be replaced? What was the element you referred to?
Kānaka and Mānuka.
Oh, Kānaka and Mānuka.
Fire risk.
Yes, I think that it's a matter of a balance, that I don't want to probably put my neck on the line in terms of saying all Kānaka and Manukau should be removed from the mountain, because I think that it's a native species. It's doing a very good job for other reasons, biodiversity, soil and water, amenity. But I do think that for the future, we need to be looking at how we have new developments, and I think the time's come to actually look at how do we modify the existing developments to make them more wildfire safe, and to work with the species that are there. So whether it's a gradual replacement process, whether it's also including some kind of landscape plan that will bring in some of the recommendations of fire and emergency in terms of distance of vegetation from structures, the guidelines in terms of thinning out vegetation, canopy trees touching. There is quite a lot of knowledge there, so I think it needs to be done sensitively and gradually, rather than let's cut down every Manukau and Kānaka on Mount Aham, because I think we'd actually increase the problems rather than decrease them if we do them in a dramatic manner.
Lisa, there's a couple more questions. I've got one, which follows on from the last one from Jill. Would it be possible or desirable for insurance companies to take an interest and perhaps adjust premiums or policies that discourage people from having high fire risk situations where they live, or otherwise using insurance premiums or that sort of thing to provide a better outcome?
I'm sorry, I think I've missed some of the key words of your question. Could you just try and repeat with the prime question?
I was wondering whether insurance premiums,
insurance, yep.
yes, could be used to improve the situation.
Interesting question. We have had indications. I can't say that I personally have explored this area thoroughly, but from a national and certainly in an international scale, the house loss from wildfires in New Zealand is not as high as other disasters, floods, earthquakes, probably the ones that immediately come to mind. And the difficulty of having premiums that are also tied to certain actions. It's probably easier if it's a burglar alarm or a smoke detector than perhaps the vegetation around a property. But this is one of the reasons why, as part of our planning research going forward, that we would like to have more communication with the insurance agencies of New Zealand, and this is primarily around some of the aspects around insurance that people mentioned, the fear that if they are in a wildfire prone area that their premiums could be affected, I should say, or even being refused insurance. So it is something that we will be trying to open the conversation and try and come up with solutions that balance different priorities and ensure that residents are adequately covered with insurance.
Lisa, we all want to buy honey with Manuka factor in it, but I am aware that that sort of stops halfway down the North Island. Here in the South Island, our problem is the Manuka blight.
Yep.
Have you noticed the state of health of Manuka trees?
and whether they're green and growing or whether they're half dead, I would think that that would have quite an effect on your fire problems.
Yes, really interesting question. It's not something I have thought about, but I will on account of your question. But I am, it brings back some early research that I did. I started my career I did a degree in forestry science, the University of Canterbury, and for my honours project, my dissertation was on honeydew. And so a similar scale insect resides on within the bark and taps into the phloem of the beech tree and exudes through a fine thread the excess sugars, which birds and insects and unfortunately wasps also feed on. The black sooty mold is actually it's an opportunist, and it's taking advantage of the sap that's occurring. So I would imagine, and I don't know too much about the Carnica situation, but generally it's a little aphid that's sucking the sap of the vegetation. And whether that has an influence in terms of fire, whether that's going to make it more or less wildfire prone, I think it's an interesting question and something I might pursue with my colleagues, but not one I can answer.
Any further questions? Lisa, you mentioned the transfer of information. Have residents indicated the most popular format to receive information from your research team?
Yes and no. In the past, I conducted a study on effective communication, and this goes back to, I think it's about 2012, and the Queenstown area was one of my study sites following the close burn fire. Apologies if I've got the year not quite right. I think the fire occurred earlier and we were there in 2012. And we did ask people about where they accessed their information, you know, the concern that brochures were something that you might at best put aside and say, oh, I must get rid of it. Others that would end up in the recycling. And I think that the knowledge we gained from people was very much that face-to-face and personal communication was by far the best. So obviously social media is taking a enormous place in terms of communication of today that wouldn't have been so such a major factor at the time. But I think that we need to look at the audience that we need to communicate to and then tailor the information for those people. And that what I found in my studies, that it was very easy to kind of throw at the community all the messages of and it's really very complex. We have fire danger ratings. We've got our half grapefruit signs by our roadsides. We have fire seasons of when there's restriction on being able to light a fire, or whether there's a wildfire ban on in terms of actually being allowed to have any fire activity. So there are a lot of different kind of rules and regulations, but if you are not a fire user, you don't need to know about where to go and get a permit or what information might govern the conditions in which you could have a fire. So we were really trying to work with fire and emergency to say, well, each time you're communicating, try and narrow it down to the sector of the community that you're trying to address, and have a message that is really tailored to that community, rather than what I consider to be a bit of a scattergun approach and hoping that it might land in a few kind of fruitful areas. And also not concentrate on those people that are already accessing your information. So some people, probably like yourselves, are very interested and will go to websites and try and track information down for yourselves. So really try and think of those that are more vulnerable, that aren't accessing information, and how to target them in a expedient means. And one of the examples I suppose I've given in this talk is really communication through well organized networks. The example I gave was working with Maori in the area, but there are many networks within communities. It's quite easy to piggyback onto activities and to go and talk with groups when COVID allows, obviously. But communication is something that you have to keep doing and tailor to the needs of the audience and the situation.
Thank you, Lisa, for coming and talking to us this afternoon. We very much appreciate the efforts you've made in preparing this talk for us. And we also, as a U3A group, are very fortunate that we can gain direct access to scientists, because the media that people might rely on, particularly in the area of wildfire, is painfully inadequate. So speaking or hearing you talk is of great interest. I was amazed at the complexity of the situation that the people at Mount Iron and surrounding areas are facing, and it's really food for thought. So whatever I want to show you appreciation of each of us.
Well, thank you very much, and I do congratulate you on your selection of wildfire as a topic, and I'm very pleased that so many people are interested in the area. And for those that do enjoy doing more reading, that on our website, the Rural Fire Research .co.nz, we do try and write our material in easy to read updates and fire technical transfer notes, so we don't have just the heavy and long-winded reports and scientific papers. So very pleased when interested people make use of our research and share the knowledge. So kia ora, thank you.
Just a reminder, I've turned the microphone off, so I'm just going to use my voice. Just a reminder, we will be back at Ascot Park next week. And then
I'll end at this point. Kia ora, thank you. Goodbye.